Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to 19th Century US. This week we'll be getting into a mixture of things that are all interconnected. So we'll be talking about urbanization, which, the growth of cities. We'll be talking about immigration, which is contributing to that growth and kind of its own thing as well as progressivism, which is linked to those, as well as the topics we've talked about previously, which is industrialization. It has a lot to do with that. So we'll be jumping in there, and I hope you're doing very well and that everyone is healthy and during these challenging times. But I'm glad you're here. So the rise of cities. Obviously, the rise of cities is a little bit of not the most accurate way to say it because cities have been around for a very long time. But the rise of the importance of cities is the key here. These are really the massive changes that are coming to the population. The population of the United States is changing in a number of ways. The industrialization is going to be drawing people away from the countryside into the cities. People are moving out of agriculture into the urban centers to get those jobs. And so that's creating new ways of life for a lot of people who had never lived that way before. A lot of families can pinpoint the moment in history when their family shifted from agricultural to urban. That's just the way it is. Now, moving to the extreme point where we are in today's history, where if your family is agricultural, you're an extreme minority rather than the most people who tend to live in urban areas, or at least urban adjacent. And so, between 1860 and 1920, the population of the urban population with the United States will shift from about 6 million to about 44 million. Now, that's a mixture of things. So the two primary factors are people moving from the countryside to the city, which we tend to think of as urbanization, but also immigration is part of that, which we'll talk about here shortly. So those two factors, people leaving agriculture into the cities, and then people heading into another country from, heading here from other countries. Those are the two driving factors that are just making these cities grow and grow and grow. And by 1920, so a little bit after the time frame that we're concerned with here, but the trend is continuing. 1920 is going to be the point when about half of the country is going to be urban. So, that's a major sort of demarcation point. And we're, after we hit that with, you're well into, you have World War I, and then you have the 20s, and then you'll hit the Great Depression, World War II. The urbanization is just going to, skyrocket through the 20th century. But 1920, approximately, it's hard to know exactly, but approximately is going to be when we hit that point. And it's going to be different for different parts of the country. Places like New York are going to be vastly different, vastly earlier than the rest. So this is 1920 being a general number. So if you took all the people in the United States, lumped them together, and say, okay, at what point was half of that population, no matter where they live, urban, that's when you hit 1920. But if you go to more rural, generally, or agricultural places like the South, then it's going to be much more towards, World War II is, when you start to see those parts of the country becoming majority urban rather than, much earlier in the 20th century. I know my family on the mom's side was shifted, I believe, around the World War II point, if I remember correctly. It was my grandmother's parents that decided to make that change. So her parents had been sharecroppers, and then they chose to move to the city and get jobs. I believe in a textile mill for a little while. My grandmom's first job was in a local soda shop, like doing like the old fashioned like soda drinks and that kind of thing. So that was the shift at that point. But yeah, that changed. It was different, and here in Texas, it'd be vastly different than what it was in other places. But you're going to have a lot of challenges, which we're going to talk about here shortly. Social problems are going to come with urbanization. Housing is going to be different. Political corruption will be an increasing factor with the growth of cities, the power of the big cities. You think about the power that's wielded in big cities. Today they often control the national narrative because of just their concentration of politics, money, and media. So those three things together kind of make them have an outsized power, even today. And there's also going to be challenges like segregation, based on either race or ethnicity or religion or class. All those factors are going to be, this boiling cauldron within the cities is going to be a challenge. So a lot of the growth in this latter part of the century is going to be urban. Interestingly, it's even in the West. You tend to think of the West as, oh, well, it's just growing in, small farms and cowboy culture and the growth of cattle farming and all that. But actually, a lot of the growth in the West was urban. So places like San Francisco, and cities that develop around the railroad or around mining. You have all these population centers that grow up, and that's where the vast majority of that continuing growth is, especially as railroads develop and more people can easily get there. If somebody, loses their livelihood in New York, they can just pick up and leave if they can just get a train ticket and head out west and try to make their way there. And that's the story of a lot of folks that end up that way. Actually, by proportion of population, so let's say out of every 100 people, how many of those are urban? The West was the Pacific Coast was actually the most urban place in the nation. So places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle are the concentrations of population, and the number of people out in the countryside, so to speak, are relatively few. So a lot of those, that's, you don't think about it that way, but that's the way it played out for the time being. In other cities that are connected to rail lines, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Omaha, Kansas City, Denver, all these places tend to be ones that are doing the growth at the time. Obviously, the Northeast is going to have the biggest centers of population. They're just going to be just massive, and for most of the country hard to even imagine, and even by some of our standards, the way that it grew at the time was challenging. Most of the people in places like New York are laborers. They're feeding into this new industrialized world. The vast majority are renters. So in New York City, 90% of the people are renting, and and that's going to cause challenges for a lot of things like health problems, because when you have such an explosion of growth, then you end up with challenging housing situations. This is where we get what was known as tenement housing, these extremely dense rental situations where you have these really, really substandard construction of housing and tons of people living in them, just very large families stuck into these very tiny apartments. And so when you hit situations where say you have a virus outbreak, then you're in a situation where people get wiped out uh, by magnitudes worse than it could be if people are spread out. And so there's going to be challenges going forward, and we'll talk a bit more about that. One of the things I did want to mention is that the cities are also the places where new technology is tried out. And that's the same as it is today. Cities are the concentration of wealth. There's opportunities for people to invest in new technology, try it out. They want to see it happen. Wealthy people are interested in making it happen. And so a few of the things that I want to mention to you, steam heat, circulating through radiators. This is a common. You'll see this in older homes. A lot of times turn of the century. If you buy a 1900 home, a 1910 home in a lot of larger cities, sometimes if they haven't been scrapped out in various phases of remodeling in the past, a lot of times people today will want to leave these as just sort of ornamental items in their house, just because it kind of connects to the past. And you still see them. But what this was doing, it was allowing a building, especially if you're building a tall building, you could have a sort of central boiler creating steam heat, and then that would travel up into the building, and then the various apartments or offices could have these radiators that had controls on them, and that would radiate heat into the room itself. And so a lot of people really like this style of heating, and it worked well for a quite long time, and it was much, much safer than having fireplaces, because if you have fireplaces throughout a large building, you're just buying lottery tickets on who's going to start the fire and forget to tend it and cause a massive problem for everybody. So that was a major change. That was a good one. Electric elevators are going to be a big thing that you're going to start seeing more and more as this century goes on, and then by the turn of the century will be commonplace. And before the Civil War, there weren't that many tall buildings, really. Not many. Most were 3 or 4 stories. You'd focus on stairwells, and you don't want people. If you live on the 10th floor of a place and all you have is a stairwell, that gets a little old going up and down. And so the vast majority of places are going to be relatively short, but with the advent of elevators, it makes it a lot more feasible to have tall buildings. And so that's going to be a big one. And along with that, it's much easier to build tall buildings with cast iron and steel. And so as the U.S. steel industry grows and grows and grows, talked a little bit about that last time with the growth of industrialization, then they're going to be able to build these very tall buildings. So that combined with elevators becomes a real plus for a lot of the population. So by the 1880s, you're seeing a lot of tall buildings, steel construction, the classic cranes and beam construction that we think of today, or we think of in these kind of pictures here with these tall buildings going up in places like New York. That's when that becomes a thing. Oh, and mass transit. I want to mention that. The idea that, we have this teeming population, we need to get them from where they are, which is probably further out in the city, to where they need to be. Just relying on those individuals to just get there can cause havoc. If every single individual is driving a car or trying to get a horse or something to get to where they need to go, it just becomes a massive traffic jam. And so a lot more cities start putting in mass transit systems with electric streetcars are going to be one of those. San Francisco is going to be an early adopter of that, even though they're a sort of a frontier type place. By the 1870s, they're going to start seeing that kind of technology there, and you'll see it in New York and other cities by the 1890s. It'll be quite prevalent, but more people are going to be able to live further out, have cheaper rent, that sort of thing, and be able to get to their work. So let me come back in just a minute, and we'll continue on.